Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Builder, spent around $2 billion building temples and monuments, including 350 statues of himself, under whose patronage Egypt observed the Golden Age. Today in this video, we will travel through the pages of history to find out how this mighty pharaoh changed the fate of Egypt by spending millions of dollars by constructing magnificent temples, monuments, and one of the expensive tombs of his wife, Nefertari. We will also discuss how he constructed magnificent monuments in ancient times in the absence of modern tools, and also how he became the first to receive a passport 3,000 years after his death. Under 66 years of reign, the Egyptian dynasty was at its peak in power and glory. The construction was at its peak. He was also known as Ramses the Builder. He spent half his fortune, which was around $2 billion, behind building temples and monuments across Egypt. He constructed 350 small statues of himself and more than 50 colossal statues across Egypt, amounting to $200 million. To show his might throughout the kingdom, he constructed a colossal in every city. No other pharaoh or king in history has received so many titles as much as Ramses did. He was called Ramses the Great, Ramses the Builder, and the most astonishing was Ramses the God. Ramses II was the ruler of Egypt from 1279 to 1213 BC. He is recorded as one of the longest ruling pharaohs of Egypt. Ramses was valiant since his childhood. He accompanied his father on military expeditions from the age of 14. At the age of 25, he became the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. Before the reign of Ramses II and his father, most of the pharaohs were indulged in leisure. Due to this, the Egyptian borders were frequently invaded. None of the pharaohs ever managed to maintain peace at Egyptian borders. Ramses II changed the fate of Egypt. He had an army of 5,000 chariots and 20,000 men. Before Ramses II, the armies didn't have chariots. Many of the pharaohs were defeated in the wars. Thus, he studied previous wars and identified the mistakes of other pharaohs. Ramses II was a great military general. He invested in designing the fastest chariots of his time. The Egyptian chariots were different from others made by other kings of those times. The chariots of Ramses II's army were made of soft wood and had an axle at the rear which enabled those chariots to move faster, even carrying 3 men. As they were made of softwood, they could even absorb high shocks of the rocky surface. The Hollywood movie Exodus depicts these chariots. These chariots were like the Russian combat vehicles. These Russian combat vehicles are the fastest armored vehicles in the world, with a top speed of 100 miles an hour. According to historians, the military senses of Ramses II helped him win many battles, including the Battle of Kadesh. With only 5,000 chariots and 20,000 alone, he was able to defeat the 40,000 soldiers' army Hittites in the Battle of Kadesh. The approximate amount spent on building these 5,000 chariots was $10 million. Another interesting fact about Ramses II was that he was the first to sign a peace treaty on the face of the earth 3,500 years back with the king of Hittites. To safeguard the Egyptian trade routes through the Red Sea, Ramses II demolished the Sardi sea pirates who plagued the Delta region. He built a chain of forts starting at the western end of the Nile at Delta, stretching to the Egyptian northern coast. This bordered fort was around 300 kilometers long on a side, built from sun-dried mud bricks and limestone. That's the distance between New York to Boston. Ramses II spent around $50 million on this 300-kilometer-long fortress. To display his power, Ramses II expanded territories from Delta to Nubia. He covered this area with many temples and spent heavily on the construction of monuments and buildings. Among these temples, his most magnificent temples were the Ramesseum, Abu Simbel, and the Temple of God Hathor. According to historians, he built these mountain-carved temples at the cost of $300 million. He is also known as Ramses the Builder because he built many archaeological marvels like temples, monuments, and palaces during his reign. Egypt is known for its 4,000-year-old pyramids and is one of the most archaeologically excavated historical countries. Most of the buildings built by Ramses II are on the list of UNESCO World Heritage. One of his archaeological marvels was the Abu Simbel Temple. It was dedicated to the Egyptian gods as well as to glorify himself. It took around 20 years to build this temple. This temple was not constructed, but carved out inside a mountain. After winning the Battle of Kadesh against Hittites, Ramses II ordered the construction of the Abu Simbel Temple. The Battle of Kadesh was one of the biggest battles of his life. 4 colossal statues of Ramses, 2 on each side of the entrance of the temple, are amazing examples of Egyptian art. Each statue was 20 to 25 feet tall. That's as tall as the Marilyn Monroe statue in Chicago. Egyptian sculptors who carved this temple were the best of those times. They built this temple with a solar alignment in such a way that the sunlight would enter the temple only twice a year. The level of perfection they showed in carving this temple was proof of their extraordinary art. The Temple of Abu Simbel was built engaging thousands of sculptors, which is estimated to cost in modern times approximately $1.7 billion. Even though the temple isn't studded much with gold or silver, it depicts the rich art form of Egypt. The Temple of Abu Simbel alone attracts millions of tourists, which is far more than those visiting the world's tallest tower, Burj Khalifa, in Dubai. To emphasize his might upon people, erected a colossal statue. This tall and fascinating statue depicted him standing tall. It weighed around 83 tons and was built with red granite. The modern-day cost of such a gigantic statue would be around $35 million. It was one of the most expensive statues of the king in Egyptian history. Did you know? After ruling for 30 years, Ramses II was transformed into an Egyptian god according to the then rituals of ancient Egypt. Ramses shifted the capital of Egypt from Thebes and built a new capital called Pi-Ramesses. The city was located near the River Nile in the Delta. Pi-Ramesses had a great geological significance. Pi-Ramesses was substantially closer to Egypt's Asian tributary kingdoms, as well as the hostile Hittite Empire's frontier. Intelligence would reach the pharaoh much faster, while the army's main corps was tented in the city and could be immediately deployed to deal with Hittite raids. Unfortunately, after the death of Ramses II, this city was abandoned. The most amazing act about Ramses II was that he had 200 wives and 100 children, the highest among other Egyptian pharaohs. Most of these marriages were part of his political strategy. His principal wife was Queen Nefertari. She was the daughter of the king of Hittite. Upon the death of Queen Nefertari, Ramses honored her by creating a temple and a magnificent tomb in the Valley of Queens. It is referred to as the Sistine Chapel in ancient Egyptian history. Ramses built the Temple of God Hathor for Queen Nefertari. He built a statue of God Hathor protecting Queen Nefertari in her honor. It was one of the most expensive tombs ever created for any queen. The tomb of Nefertari is around 80 square meters and is covered with pictures of Nefertari all around. It was one of the largest in the Valley of the Queens. Historians estimate such magnificence in modern times would cost no less than $40 to $50 million. Here's an astonishing fact about the tomb of Queen Nefertari. The visit is not open to all and is allowed by special permit only at the cost of $3,000. Ramses II built one of the largest temples in the history of Egypt, which was known as the Ramesseum. The temple stood on two walls with a huge corridor and two statues of sphinxes in the middle. There are grand oriside columns that depict the story of Ramses II becoming Osiris, the god of the underworld. According to the historian, it was filled with silver, gold, royal linen, and costly stones. His glory fascinated many, and he became the most successful pharaoh of ancient Egyptian history. Ramses II built around 350 statues of himself during his reign, and out of which 50 statues are around 65 feet tall. Archaeologists say that no ruler in Egypt has built so many statues of himself. The number of statues that he had of himself is even more than wax statues in the Madame Tussauds Museum. Ramses II built the largest individual tomb of the Valley of the Kings for himself. This royal tomb was named House of Gold. The tomb is so huge that it can occupy 100 small tombs. Today, the Valley of the Kings is also a World Heritage Site. The most bizarre fact about Ramses II was that thousands of years later, after his death, his legacy continued. Have you ever heard of a dead body being issued a passport? Why would a dead body need a passport? In 1974, archaeologists found the mummified body of Ramses II. It was a 3,000 years old mummy and was in a very deteriorated state. The mummy of Ramses II was issued a passport as it had to be taken to Paris for restoration. The passport was one of its kind and had never been issued. The passport included a photo of Ramses II's ancient face, and his occupation was mentioned in the passport as deceased king. This was how the great Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II lived and spent his life. Hope you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to our channel for more historical facts and check out this next video on screen now.